We're at 1:30, so I might begin. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Julia Unwin. I'm the Commercial Director for Government Strategy and Growth at Isentia, leading our work with federal, state and local government teams across Australia. As we're meeting virtually today, I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the Canberra region where I'm located. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and celebrate their enduring connection to this country. A little housekeeping first. Today's webinar, you can find the Q&A box in the centre of your screen there. We will try and get to as many questions as we can over the next hour with the team will be presenting first. We do have a lot of viewers with us today, so we may not get to all of your questions, but we will do our best to follow up. And we are recording this session and we will share the link with you all to watch back and share over the next few days. So it's my absolute pleasure to be hosting today's webinar and sharing with you all the results of the 2026 Digital News Report from the News and Media Research Centre at the University of Canberra. This report is part of a long-running international survey coordinated by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. The News and Media Research Centre at the University of Canberra is the Australian Partner Institute, and this is their 12th annual edition of the DNR. I have a personal connection to the topic today. I am a journalism graduate of the University of Canberra quite a while ago, and Isentia has employed many quality University of Canberra graduates over our long history. And I'm also lucky enough to work with the broader UC team in my day-to-day role at Isentia. Maybe more importantly, I'm also an avid follower of the DNR, and I have been since 2020. I was previously a client, and in 2020, I moved into a comms director role at that very moment when we moved from the bushfires straight into the pandemic. So that report that year showed that despite a brief COVID bump, that audiences began to turn away from news. So of course, in 2020, the AI and LLMs like ChatGPT also wasn't featuring much in people's news diet at that stage. But fast forward to 2026, and this year's Digital News Report shows some seismic, but I think quite positive shifts. It's still the most authoritative annual snapshot of how Australians consume, trust, and engage with news. And I know for both Isentia and for our clients, the DNR offers evidence-based insights into audience behaviour, such as AI-driven news, and how the trust in media is evolving over time. So hopefully today's presentation and Q&A will help those of you who've joined us to make smarter decisions about your comms and reputation management and media strategy. So I'll introduce our esteemed guests for the webinar. Dr. Sora Park is a Professor of Communication and is the Director of the News and Media Research Centre at the University of Canberra, and she is an ICA Fellow. Sora's research focuses on digital media users, media markets and media policy. She is the project lead of the annual Digital News Report Australia. Dr. Momoko Fujita is a Senior Lecturer and Deputy Director of the News and Media Research Centre. She researches the positive and negative influences of emerging digital media and information communication technology on consumer behaviour and well-being. Sora and Momoko, welcome, and thank you so much for giving us your time today. I will hand over to you now to take us through the top line findings of this year's report, and then we'll move over into the Q&A. So over to you.
Thanks, Julia, and hello everyone. I'm Sora Park, and I'll be presenting the first half, and then my colleague and co-author of the report, Momoko, will present the second half. I might share the screen now. Yep, so as Julia introduced, the Digital News Report is a global annual survey conducted with more than 90,000 people in 48 countries in all 6 continents. And this is our 12th report in Australia. This year, we surveyed 2,025 adults online in January and February this year. And we tried to make sure that it represents the Australian population. So we have education, income, political quotas, and of course, age, gender, region are reflected. The report is now available to download from our website with 8 chapters and 11 commentaries. We obviously won't be able to go through all of the content in detail today, but if your organization would like a deeper dive into any of the topics, you can request a briefing through our website after the presentation. So the first topic is about general news consumption trends, which Julia said, rightly, that it's rapidly shifting and we see yet another shift this year. The first trend I'd like to share is that Australia is bucking the global trend that global news consumption and interest have been declining in the past decade. But the proportion of Australians accessing news more than once a day, which we label as heavy news consumers, has increased to 56%, which is up from 53% in 2025. And more than half of respondents say they are extremely or very interested in news. And this is also an increase of 5 percentage points in the past 5 years. And this trend is mainly driven by younger audiences. And for the first time, under 25s have a higher interest in politics compared to people above the age of 35. This year, social media has emerged as the second most used news source among Australians, 56%, just 1 percentage point behind TV, and ahead of online news use. Here, online news use means news you access through news websites or apps, so going directly to news brands. And not surprising that print has declined another 3 percentage points. The use of podcasts and AI chatbots for news, we started to track since last year, has reached 13 and 9% respectively, but they're rapidly growing. As you can see from this chart, there is a big generational gap in where people get their news. Under 35s are most likely to use online news sources, and they are also more likely than 35 plus to access news on newer platforms such as podcasts and AI chatbots. We also see an increase in the number of people only using social media to get news. And again, there is a generational and gender gap, with 16% of those under 35 and 12% of women saying they only get news from social media. Globally, social media is taking over traditional media. As you can see from the two charts, TV is a source of news, has been dropping consistently. And on the other hand, social media is growing. And Australia appears to sit around the middle of the international range. As with many other indicators, we're usually in the mid-range. And this suggests that while TV remains an important news source for many Australians, the shift towards social media and online news is well underway. News consumers are increasingly accessing a wider range of news brands as well, because there are on all these digital platforms, they probably have more access to multiple brands. So more than 1/3 of people report using 7 or more news brands in the past week. And this is a 6 percentage point increase from last year. So this coincides with the increase in the use of social media. So the use of multiple news brand is particularly prominent among younger groups. As the figure shows, those under 35, it's between 43% and 50% saying they access 7 or more news brands in the past week, compared to only 23% to 34% among those aged 35 and over. This means audiences are becoming more fragmented, and people are no longer loyal to a small set of news outlets. Instead, they're discovering news across multiple platforms and brands. And this means that attention is dispersed and competition is not just between brands, but within a complex media ecosystem. Another trend we see is that more Australians are now watching news videos on social media. 3/4 report having watched news-related videos in the past week, and this is a 10 percentage point increase in the past 3 years. And Facebook remains the most widely used platform for news videos at 39%, followed by YouTube, 34%. And by contrast, watching news on news websites or apps have remained stable at 26% over the past 3 years. And of course, young people are much more likely to consume news videos, with 89% of those under 35 saying they have watched news-related videos in the past week. This is perhaps related to the spread of smart TVs. So this year we asked respondents who use a smart TV to access news whether they use it for video apps. Among respondents, about half say they have smart TVs and they watch it for news. And of those who say they watch it for news, 57% say they use video apps on their smart TV screens, such as YouTube, to watch news. And as you can see with the distribution among demographics, men, younger people, those with high income, and those with high levels of education, those living in cities, are much more likely to report watching news on video apps through their smart TVs. The next topic is more focused on digital platforms and how that affects news consumption. So news audiences on social media are centralized around a handful of growing brands. If you look at the left side of the chart, this is the use of social media platforms generally, and on the right, you can see the use of these platforms for news. So Facebook, 40%, is still the most used social media platform for news, even though they have, deprioritized news. It's still the most popular source of news, followed by YouTube, 32%, and Instagram, 24%. TikTok, 19%, is also rapidly growing as a news source, seeing a 5 percentage point increase in the past year. And this shows that people are increasingly getting news from image-based or video-based platforms, which is consistent with the consumption of news videos. Among young people, there was an increase in the use of TikTok this year, and 48% of 18 to 24-year-olds use it for news. And this was a 14 percentage point growth in the past year, so it's rapidly growing among younger cohorts. And we asked respondents who use social media platforms for news about their intentions when accessing news on these platforms. And among those who use Facebook for news, more than half, like 55%, say they mostly see news while they are on Facebook for other reasons. So the majority of news consumption is incidental. And a similar proportion of Instagram news users report getting news incidentally, 56%. This means that the news people access on these platforms is mainly driven by algorithms rather than their active seeking. For younger cohorts, though, YouTube is perceived as a useful way to seek news compared to older generations who mostly see news when on YouTube incidentally. And so this means younger audiences are more active seekers of news, particularly when they are on YouTube. The use of AI chatbots such as ChatGPT or Gemini for news is increasing steadily, reaching a total of 9%, and that was a 3 percentage growth in the past year. This might seem very small, but this is specifically only focused on, AI, Gen AI platforms, and we haven't included people's use of news on search engines and, using AI summaries on search engines or social media. So this only specifically focuses on chatbot use for news. And as you can see, the growth is quite uneven, where younger people, those with high education, those living in the city are much more likely to have increased their use of AI chatbots in the past year. So now city residents are almost 3 times as likely to use AI chatbots for news compared to regional Australians. Globally, there's been a growth in AI chatbot use for news, as in 2025, Australians' AI chatbot use remain on par with global average, which is roughly 9 percentage points. We asked people who use AI chatbots for news the main reasons why. The top reason was because AI collates stories from different news sources into a single response, highly rating its news aggregation function. Users also value the tools for explaining and simplifying complex information, with 43% saying they ask follow-up questions and 42% saying they rely on AI summaries. And more than 1/3 AI users say AI chatbots are more reliable and faster than other methods of accessing news. In an environment where rapid adoption of AI and the uncertainty around the loss of visibility of news on search engines, social media, and AI platforms is growing, and we asked respondents how often they click through the links to the original news sources. Search engines drive the most frequent traffic to sources, with 45% saying they click through always or sometimes. 45% saying always or often, and 43% saying sometimes. And 38% of AI chatbot news users and 37% of social or video networks click through. So it is not that much, but again, this figure is based on self-reports. So the actual figures could be even lower because people tend to remember what they click through rather than what they did not click through. The motivation for clicking through to the original sources differ slightly depending on the platform. Across all platforms, though, the need for more detail is the most common reason. It's slightly higher for social media and search engines than AI chatbots. But when people are on AI chatbots, they are more likely to click when they want to verify the accuracy of the news. And they are also more likely to click through to find out more about the news source. So there is a bit more of a skepticism when they're using AI. Now I'll stop here and pass over to Momoko to present the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Sora. So the next topic is changing news habits. So beyond platforms, we're also seeing some changes in how Australians access news and consume news. So here, this is one of those findings that reminds us how different younger audiences are. So 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds have never regularly used newspapers as a news source, and 53% have never used radio for news. So what stands out here is, though, that many younger Australians never developed traditional news habits in the first place. Okay, so despite all the disruption we've discussed today so far, many news habits remain quite stable. So people tend to access news from the same brands or outlets using the same devices and in the same places at similar times, follow similar topics, and maintain regular routines. So while people's routines remain quite stable, the sources they rely on for news differ substantially by age. So here the graph shows nearly half of people aged 65 and over say they use the same news brands every day. But younger Australians are more likely to move between different sources. As we saw earlier, they use more news brands, so it makes sense that they see they're less loyal to a particular outlet. Okay, so the next topic is influencers. One of the biggest developments in this year is the growing role of news creators and influencers. So for many younger Australians, these people are now important sources of information. So among half of Australians now consume news from creators, content creators, or influencers. And among the younger age group, it rises to around 70%. So we can confidently say creators are no longer fringe part of the news ecosystem, but they are a mainstream source of information for many Australians, especially those who are young, male, are highly educated, and those who live in major cities. Okay, so what is particularly interesting is that many younger Australians, including 52% of 18 to 24 years old and 53% of 25 to 34s, say creators meet most of all of their news needs. So for communicators and news for organizations, for example, that's a signal that creators are offering something audiences feel they aren't always getting elsewhere. So whether that's accessibility or the relevance, personality, or explanation. Okay, so when we asked people why they value creators and influencers, the answers are very consistent. Creators and influencers are seen as more entertaining, relatable, easier to understand, and more authentic than traditional news. So those are the qualities that resonate strongly with younger audiences. And the most revealing finding here is that people who distrust traditional news are significantly more likely to see creators or influencers as authentic and relatable. As you can see in the graph, the gap between news trusters, those who trust news, and distrusters are quite big when it comes to perceived authenticity and relatability of news. Perhaps these people are finding news creators and influencers who they feel personal connections with more trustworthy than media organizations. Okay, moving on to the next topic. So we have been tracking people's trust in news quite some time, and we see it as becoming increasingly important, particularly with the growing concerns around misinformation. So this figure shows that trust in news remains relatively stable at 43% overall this year, but trust in My News, so the personally selected news sources, is noticeably higher than last year at 54%. So in particular, trust in My News among under 35-year-olds increased to 60% this year, suggesting younger people have growing confidence in the sources they choose to follow. So even though Australians increasingly use social media and AI chatbots for news, they remain skeptical about news on those platforms. 51% say they don't trust news on social media, and 49% distrust news from AI chatbots. On the other hand, people tend to trust news from search engines more than social or AI news. So not surprisingly, people who distrust news are substantially more likely to avoid news, with 80% of them avoid news often, sometimes, or occasionally, compared with around 57% of those who trust it. We also see a similar pattern when looking at people distrust news from social media, search engines, and AI chatbots. So when people feel uncertain about the reliability of information, perhaps many don't necessarily seek more information, so instead they avoid altogether. And concerns about misinformation continues to increase, and Australia remains above the global average, with concern rising to 77% this year. So news avoidance is also high, but concern about misinformation is growing faster than news avoidance, suggesting that Australians are increasingly aware of the problem and looking for ways to navigate the misinformation concern problem rather than disengaging with news completely. Okay, so key takeaways. To wrap up this presentation, we would like to leave you with a few key takeaways from this year's report. So first, information access is now largely mediated by digital platforms rather than direct visit to traditional news outlets. So people are increasingly encountering news through social media, creators, so influencers, AI chatbots, and search engines. And this makes it more important than ever to establish direct relationships with audiences. So organizations can no longer assume people will find their information organically. They need to be present where their audiences already spent their time. Third, trust is evolving. So increasingly, trust is shaped by authenticity, transparency, and personal connection rather than simply institutional authority. So this is one reason why creators and influencers resonate with many audiences, particularly younger group. Fourth, trusted information sources remain critical, so particularly during periods of uncertainty or crisis. Even as audiences use social platforms and AI tools, they still need reliable places to verify information. And finally, there is a growing, so fifth, there is growing responsibility to educate the public. So audiences are navigating a much more complex information environment. So explainers, contextual content, and public education have become increasingly important. And media literacy and AI literacy are no longer niche skills. So frontline communicators increasingly need to understand how information moves across platforms and how AI tools are being used and how audiences evaluate information. And finally, transparency matters. As organizations adopt AI and other new technologies, being open about how those tools are used will be essential for maintaining public trust. And that's the end of our presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, guys. Really appreciate you taking us through at that level of detail. We are having some questions coming through on the Q&A, so just a reminder to type them in there and we will work through those. I just quickly wanted to unpack the AI question and the generative AI work that you did. So while only 9% of the respondents said that they're accessing news through an LLM, which I must admit I haven't tried, but I will now, it looks like they do have trust in it as a source, which is interesting in Australia with our copyright laws and how much actual news is going in there. But they've said as well they'd use it to follow up about stories, and I guess that, deeper education piece. How do you guys see that evolving over the next 12 months? And do you think more traditional media players are looking at their roles in the AI models now?
Yeah, I might answer that question. Yes, it's interesting. I think people use AI mainly for convenience because the trust they place in the news they find on those platforms is still very low. And there's a definite need for news to be made or information on news to be made a bit easier to access and understand. And we knew that from years of, research, like people find news very difficult and hard to understand, especially younger people, because a lot of it comes from the way traditional news media distributes information. They're based on the assumption that people will come regularly in front of the screen or open a newspaper at the same time, so they're regularly kept up with information. Whereas, as you saw from the presentation, people's news consumption habit is not consistent, so they might not see the same brand every day. And so news is often presented to them incidentally out of context. So people really are thirsty to get some context behind news, some explainers, and that's why they turn to things like AI. But their trust is still very low because they're skeptical of the technology, and AI is not very reliable. But it's likely to rapidly increase in the use, because I don't think anyone can avoid AI now. Like if you open your phone, it's all AI there without actively using it. So it will rapidly grow, and news organizations will probably embrace this. Maybe not as fast as audiences, but I think they should embrace it quickly so that they will get direct access to audiences. Even through AI, they'll find ways to present news so that people can discover their news, even if it's through AI. So they really need to find a way to link with audiences. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. I guess that it's that meeting them where they're at.
Yeah.
Very much. Maybe just staying in that younger audience space. Really interested in the part around the news creators and influencers. Obviously, that's showing as being really high for engagement levels, and obviously people feel like these influencers are meeting their news needs. Do you think there's thinking about the future, that's an area of concern around the media literacy for younger audiences? Or do you think it's, helping to increase the diversity of voices that are available for young people?
Yeah, I'll answer that question. Thank you. Yes, we think probably it's both an opportunity and a challenge, because influencers and creators obviously can broaden the range of voices and perspectives and formats available to young people in a way that suits their needs, especially on platforms where younger audiences increasingly consume news. The media literacy concern is more to do with the verification, fact checking, not really the diversity itself. So the report finds Australians are more likely to see influencers as a major source of misinformation than politicians or journalists, and highlighting the importance of helping younger audiences access assess the news credibility and evidence, I think. And the key issue is probably ensuring younger people can distinguish trusted information from opinions or personal commentaries. So rather than resisting, so the news organization, instead of resisting creators and influencers, they should focus on providing trusted, transparent journalism, as they do, in a space where young people or audiences already spend their time. Yeah.
We've got an interesting tie-in here from the audience. Claudia says, very interesting report. And she just wanted to clarify, and I did wonder about this myself, the definition of influencer. So she follows a news influencer who gives a weekly news update in a way that is Gen Z palatable, and it's on TikTok, but she actually works for The Age. So would that be considered a news influencer or a traditional media outlet on TikTok? What's the distinction there in the research?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes, so it's still a very, very blurry area. So this year we asked, do you access news through influencers? And then we asked people to name the influencer they use the most. And we got more than 300 different individuals and organizations. Right. And we analyzed the names and organizations. And it turns out that audiences often do not make that distinction. If they follow somebody as a personality-driven news provider, they're all influencers. So we saw a lot of names of journalists in the list. We also saw names of certain news organizations or podcasts. So I think from the audience's perspective, it's the distinction is not really important. It's probably the way they present news is probably a better definition of influencer. Yeah.
And building on that, Caleb's asked, and do you find that more people are accessing news through those influencers or through traditional media's social media accounts?
It's very hard to
it's hard to
know
distinguish.
because
Yes.
again, there's a blurry boundary. Although when on social media, we often ask the question, so who do you pay attention to when you're on social media as a source of news? The top answer is always mainstream media. So people, actively follow all the news brands on social media. So that's how they get news when on social media. So and 56% say they access news on social media, and 43% say they access news through influencers. So it's hard to know which is, but because it's such a mixture of, hybrid way of consuming news.
Yeah. And I guess it builds on that trust space as well. And obviously, if there's a media brand behind people, that obviously establishes trust. But then obviously people are wanting the opinion side of that as well. So I guess, there's broadly low trust on news on social media and AI, but there's high level of trust in the My News, which obviously includes both of those sources as well. So how do you describe that challenge around news consumption becoming insular to individuals? And do you think that's something that the traditional news brands are starting to address?
I can answer that question. So yes, we understand the challenge of people trust My News more than news in general, which may or may not reinforce selective exposure and information silos. But audiences may feel well informed because they trust the sources they personally choose, even when those sources represent a relatively narrow range of perspectives. But they, as we saw earlier, they actually consume more brands, news. So especially young people consume more news brands, and I think having sort of those go-to news channels, go-to news sources, is not a necessarily bad thing because they do actually consume a variety of news. It's just that there is one or two particular sources that they always kind of rely on. So it's might not be a bad thing, I suppose. And traditional news organizations are, I guess, already responding by focusing more on, we said this earlier, like the explainers of certain issues, or verification, fact checking, and transparency, and reaching audiences on the platforms they use. So the aim here is probably not just to attract attention, but to provide trusted content and broader perspectives in an increasingly fragmented news environment.
Yeah. No, and hopefully the budgets remain in the newsrooms to keep those fact checks and deeper dives going. Obviously, we can see that Australians are showing that higher level of concern around misinformation, and that's increased again in this year's report. Are you guys across what the main drivers for that is, and particularly when we compare, obviously, to global results in that misinformation space?
I think that the Australians' high concern reflects the prominence of misinformation in public debate. So we talk about misinformation probably more compared to other global counterparts, and the perception that social media and influencers are major sources of false or misleading content is probably something that's very unique to Australian. And Australia recorded the highest level of concern, obviously. We talk about this. And I think it also reflects growing complexity in information environment. So with news increasingly accessed through social media creators, AI, chatbots, Australians are more aware of the challenge of determining what information is trustworthy, what is true, and consequently, they're more alert or conscious to misinformation risk. Therefore, I guess that the media literacy is quite higher compared to other countries, I suppose. I don't know. So, sorry, I might have something.
No, that was a hard one. That was a hard one.
I agree. Yeah. So media literacy is very low across the board, but Australia is slightly higher than other countries, which is a good thing. And I think it's mainly because we have some good education in school. So younger people have access to media literacy education, at least in the past 10 years or so. So yeah, media literacy is actually a bit higher than global average. So maybe that awareness is important, that they are concerned about misinformation. But we also see that Australians have low confidence in their ability to verify information. So that anxiety that, I know there's lots of misinformation out there, but I'm not confident. So I think that increases the concern.
Yeah. And yes, shout out to all the State Department of Educations out there that have it in their syllabus. I think it's yes, definitely the research shows the importance of that media literacy from a young age and throughout life. I've got a more technical question now from Christian in the audience. They ask, how much of the survey focuses on smaller players in Western social media, so Weibo or also players like Reddit for news?
Yeah, we do track a lot of them, most of them, but we have a threshold. If 1 year we get less than 3% response, we swap it with another emerging platform the next year so that we can track over time. So in the past, we have measured Weibo and WeChat and all the smaller players, but not consistently every year. And in the report, we don't report the very small players. So if anyone's interested in the broader overview, we're happy to do another briefing or share the data.
Excellent. We've got another question on social from Anna Cannon, who asks, on social, was it established in the research if people are consuming news published within the day, breaking news, or are they consuming older stories that are still circulating?
Yeah, very, very important question. That's really hard to know in a survey because, it's people probably don't know themselves. And the way we structure the question is we mostly use a very longer term approach so that most people can answer a question. So not everyone consumes news daily. That's a bit like half of Australians don't consume news every day. So we give a longer range, like weekly use or monthly use, So
Yeah, no, I also find and our clients as well, when things pop up again and you're just not sure what's driven that, and it could be quite old. So I do wonder, I think it's a really good question of I guess the timing and salience of news on those channels, and what drives things to re-emerge. But I guess it's still all news. It's just the currency of it. We've got another question around socials from Amanda. Do you see value in summarizing news on social posts and then pushing users through to websites for the full story? Or should news be self-contained in social media where the audiences are?
Do you want to answer that, Momoko?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And I think this sort of shorter, snackable version of news content happens quite a lot on social media. And there's a link, and then just go to the website for full story. That's a very common practice, I suppose. But social media platforms, increasingly, they're being very sneaky, and they're trying to keep the audience as much as possible on their platform rather than getting them to direct it to outside, the social media platform. So, and then that is affecting the algorithm as well. I mean, the way the news appear on news feeds as well. So I think it's just that you need to have the right balance. But from the audience's perspective, definitely they're not on social media to read, I don't know, 1,000 words article. So I think the expectation is that, it has to be very snackable and easy to digest, but also there's some sort of information that or links to the website that they can actually further understand. But yes, it's a difficult space. Yeah.
And I imagine paywalls come into that as well when people go to click on that story. And I wonder if they then can consider that consuming the news item without actually then clicking through when it's just the headline. It's a real challenge. I've got another more technical research question here from Cheryl. Is there data around blue collar versus white collar workers and their preferences for news sources?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have never asked that occupation question. We would love to. Yeah, but in our next project, which we will introduce later, we are actually going to ask occupation to see if people's consumption of AI-related news is linked to, their occupation or their, skill level. Yeah, but in our survey, education is a very strong predictor of most of the indicators. So yeah, that's probably the closest we can get to any occupation. Yeah.
No, excellent question as well. I agree. I'm going to throw some harder ones at you now that are probably very specific to our audience today. Brian has said, can we go back to the title of today's webinar? For news organisations and for communicators, what do you think it takes to capture attention in the news landscape?
Yeah, that's $1 million question. Very important. So yeah, do you want to have a go, Momoko?
Yeah, so we kind of briefly touched on that. I guess in traditional news, I suppose the question is about traditional news organizations. So they, based on the data, we think that rather than trying to, become like influencers, of course they probably need to work with them, but they really should focus on what they do really good. So, trusted journalism, good content, that sort of, what they're already strong. But I guess they need to be on the places where audiences are today. So as we saw that, the younger audiences in particular, they just didn't grow up with the TVs and radios and maybe TVs, but the radios or newspapers. So that's not the place that news organizations should be, trying to reach the younger audiences. So content should be trustworthy, but the way they reach audiences should be different, and making also content accessible, something we talk about with influencers. Collaborating with influencers could be a good opportunity as well.
Excellent. I've got another interesting one here from Karen, and it's relevant to the timing, I think, of when the research was conducted. Is it possible to identify when breaking news occurs, such as the Bondi incident late last year, whether people go to social media to find out information about it first, or if they go to online websites and TV broadcasts of more traditional media organisations like the ABC first?
Yeah, very good question. But the survey is very, we don't ask that question in the survey, but from other research and other anecdotal evidence, people mainly get breaking news not from traditional news, but on social media. And in the AI question, people actually thought it was a great place to get updated news. So I think it's still heavily digital intermediaries is where people actually get the first, breaking news. Yeah.
It's I also find when there is something really big I think it was the shark attacks in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, that when you go to the socials, that the news is really dominating in the algorithm as well, which I think is
Yeah.
is a good thing.
Yeah.
I will throw another trickier one at you again. This one's from Sheba. I hope I've pronounced that right. If you were developing a comms strategy today for your department or team, what would be the first strategic risk you would put on the radar for the next 3 to 5 years?
Strategic risk. I guess the big risk is to, keep on doing what, traditional communicators have been doing. I think communicators, as Momoko said, they have to embrace this new format and style of communication that people are now so used to. Like, they're not used to one-way communication anymore. They want very personalized, like conversational, very relatable formats and style. And it's not about the content per se. I think it's how the information is delivered. Yeah.
I think adding to that, like in terms of risks that need to be considered for the next 3 to 5 years, I think that was a kind of mid-range risk, strategic risk for communicators, probably something to do with the AI as well. So we see in the news industry that a lot of news organizations today block the web crawling so that the AI platforms cannot scrape the news content from the news website, for example. I think that's quite applicable to comms, so government communication or public communication, not-for-profits. Everyone produce some sort of communication online in particular, and something that you want to consider. Blocking is fine, easy solution if you're concerned about copyright, but then that information, high quality information may not be feed into the algorithm or large language model, meaning that those news or information they're getting through AI platforms may be crap. Not based on, I guess, high quality costs, because AI can only rely on something produced in the past. So that's something just came up in my mind is AI, what to do with the copyright issue, to what to do with the credibility of information, and what to do with your role as a communicator. You obviously want to disseminate the factual, accurate, reliable information. So how do you balance that? That could be something, to consider.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And 3 to 5 years is a long time scale to be looking at now. When we think back 3 to 5 years ago and how much has changed. But I definitely agree about thinking how the large language models work to pull that content in if obviously that's on the increase dramatically. So I definitely would be putting that on the radar as well. I think we've got time for one more question. And it sort of builds on misinformation, but I think it's something that came up at the Royal Commission a few weeks ago when they were looking at the media. Do you guys look at changes in perception around bias in news media?
Perhaps not necessarily changes. We don't have a tracking question of bias, but we have sometimes asked questions about, perceptions of news media bias or representation, impartiality. And overall, Australians are very dissatisfied with, the lack of impartiality or lack of independence, neutrality in the mainstream news media. There is a lot of skepticism around the bias in the news. So that is also a big issue that is challenging for news organizations, because that's where they are losing trust because they're perceived to be biased or one-sided. But comparing to other countries, we're in a pretty better shape in terms of like polarization and, extreme views. Most of our news outlets have a very balanced audience with both left and right and center consuming their news content. So yeah, globally comparing, we're not too bad, but still there's this deep distrust and dissatisfaction among audiences.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think it comes back to that media literacy piece as well of what does balanced reporting look like.
Yeah.
But I understand for the newsrooms when, the audiences are so hard to capture why they might lean into that space. But yeah, that's a tricky one. But yeah, definitely agree that Australians are obviously very wary of it. We only have a few minutes left. I just wanted to ask, what are you guys looking at for next year's report? I'm sure you're already thinking about it. What are you most, I guess, curious about capturing or looking towards?
Yeah, so definitely more on influencers. Yeah, that's certainly something really surprised us this year, that so many people were relying on influencers. Yeah, and of course, AI would also be another topic we need to keep track of. Yeah. Anything else,
Yes.
Momoko?
Yes, and regarding the AI part, that we have something current project working on this future of AI in news, and the report is coming. So thanks for the sharing the information screen. So yes, this is something that we are currently working on and looking at publishing later in the year. Sora, is it?
Yes, so yeah, our AI project, yes. So it's with 9 countries: UK, US, Denmark, France, Finland, Norway, Australia, Japan, Argentina. So it's a good mix of countries in different parts of the world, and it's focusing on generative AI and news. So there are lots and lots of studies on Gen AI or AI generally, but none of them look specifically in relation to news. So this is probably going to be one of the first of its kind that we're focusing on news consumption through generative AI and people's attitude and perceptions about the use of Gen AI in news production and also in other, domains of life, including health and things like that. Yeah.
Amazing. We might have to get you back later in the year then to go
Yeah,
over those
we'd be happy
findings.
to.
That sounds
Yeah.
sounds fascinating and something that we are definitely talking about with our clients every single day. Thank you so much for your time today. You've been incredibly generous, and we've got lots of compliments coming through in the Q&A on the research. So well done. We did not quite get enough time to get to some of the questions, so the guys have generously offered to follow those up. We'll be putting together a blog post on our website today, and we will be emailing around this recording. So please look out for that. Again, thank you very much for joining us all, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.